I became a film critic in a rather absurd way. I was on The Guardian, and I was up in Manchester in the features department, designing pages. And you know, in the features department in Manchester, you could sometimes go and review a play or a concert or a film. But that was the icing on the cake, you know, to get out of the office. Then I came down to London and was again features sub-editor. And then they decided that they were going to do racing, and because it was the only paper which didn't do any racing at all. And they looked around the office and they couldn't find anybody except me who knew the back end of a horse from the front. And so they said, "Will you do the racing?" And I said, to get out of the office, well, that was all right, I'll do it. I did it for a bit, but only for a bit. And then they engaged some professional, Richard Berlin, to do it. And at one stage, I was deputy theatre critic, racing correspondent, and midnight sub. I was subbing in Neville Cardis's pieces, which he used to write in longhand and send by his chauffeur. And I was the only one who could read his language. Anyway, after being deputy theatre critic, I became, for some reason, deputy film critic. And then they sacked Richard Roud, who was a great critic. And they sacked him because he wrote a one-word review of Sound of Music. And it was The Sound of Music, bracket, Odeon Leicester Square, U, unbracket, no. And of course, the editor said, look, it's the most successful film ever, as it was at that time. You really have to give your reasons why you don't like it. You can't just say no. And more or less they sacked him. So I became film critic. After his sacking, the editor, Peter Preston, cast around for someone to be film critic. And it was a real fluke. He decided upon me. It was a risk, but he thought, well, maybe it's all right. And so I stayed as film critic for 40 years. Ridiculous.
Did you, before you started in that position as film critic on The Guardian, did you have any past experience with this kind of work, or did you just have any...
Well, I used to review quite a lot. I mean, they'd send me off to review plays and sometimes to a concert or a ballet or something like that. But at university, I was on the sort of chairman of the Film Society movement, you know, so I did know a bit about film. The trouble was I hadn't seen the films of the last 10 years when I was film critic, which is rather difficult. But my first year, it wasn't very good, but I got Critic of the Year. God knows how. From Michael Foote. He was the man who gave it to me. Michael Foote and Reb Butler, can you believe it?
Well, perhaps your perceptions of the
I just thought that neither of them know anything about film. Otherwise, they'd never have given me the award. But I did get that, and then, of course, I was set, because having been made Critic of the Year for some unknown reason, the editor decided to keep me there. And I did get better, I hope. I think there are lots of popular misconceptions about critics, whether it's about film critics or not. I'm sure it is about film critics as well, but they seem to think that film critics have a very easy life, and it's a wonderful job, and you can say what you like about a film, and you can kill people's careers, or you can boost them up. And I think that's pretty wrong, really, because most of the films we see now are awful. You know, pretty mediocre. And it's only occasionally that you get a film which really interests you. And, you know, if you're seeing 15 films in a week, as I often was, not on The Guardian at first, because in those days it was only about 5 films at the most. So it was relatively easy. And also, at that time, it was very influential, because you couldn't do anything about Superman or whatever, you know. But you certainly could about the foreign films which came. And if you said the foreign films were good, they'd form a queue at the box office. it might evaporate within 2 days if they didn't like what you said, if they decided the film wasn't as good as you said it was. I think probably a bad review from me at one stage for a certain kind of film would not help it at all. And I can remember telling one director he really should stop making films. It wasn't his métier. It was an awful film. And years later he wrote to me and said, "Thank you so much for your review. I was very upset at the time, but now I'm in a much better job and I realised that I was not a filmmaker."
That's amazing.
On the other hand, the best Spanish film ever made, in my opinion, Spirit of the Beehive,
Oh, yes.
I saw at San Sebastian, and nobody else was in the audience except me and David Robinson, who was the Times at that time. And we put out an advertisement in the daily film thing, which comes out at the San Sebastian Festival, or did, saying, "You must go and see this film, it's a masterpiece." And they packed in, everybody packed in, whether they liked it or not, I don't know. But I came back home and I told the Academy, which was then the Echt Art House. And the Academy looked at it and said, "Yes, you're right, it's a wonderful film, but it's not going to make us a penny." And I said, "Oh, well, I do hope you'll show it." And George Hollering, who was then the Academy's boss, said, "Okay, I suppose I'll have to put it on." And he put it on. It lasted 8 months. I mean, it did really well. So that's a huge success for me and David Robinson, by the way, and one or two other critics as well. But you can have a huge success, and you can have an abysmal failure. Many's the film I've really liked, which has done nothing at the box office at all. And in fact, most people have said, "Oh, he's completely wrong." But on the whole, as a critic in those days, and I'm talking of about 30 years ago, you could have a profound effect. And what I always say is, don't ever believe what critics tell you unless you've read them regularly and on the whole you agree with them. And if that's the case, then go on reading them and you won't go very far wrong. But if you don't like their prejudices, go to somebody else. Well, there are different kinds of film criticism. There's the academic film criticism, there's the sight and sound type, there's the positive type, magazine type, and there's newspaper critics. So I've really only been a newspaper critic, really, doing other things perhaps, but a newspaper critic. And there, I think, the first thing you've got to do is write entertainingly, because really, the number of times I've been on top of a bus and watched someone pick up The Guardian on the appropriate day and read about 2 paragraphs of my stuff and then turn the page. So you've got to write well, and you've got to write quickly, because honestly, you haven't much time to think if there's 15 films coming out, or if you're at a festival and they want the stuff very quickly. So you've got to write well, you've got to be a good journalist, and you've got to write to the length they want. There's no much point in writing 800 words when they only want 400, because they'll just cut, and they'll cut the best things probably from the review. So first of all, you've got to be a journalist. Secondly, I think you really have to know something about other things than film, because film is an amalgam of all the arts. If you know nothing about music and nothing about art and nothing about sculpture and nothing about the other arts, you're not a very good film critic, quite frankly. So you've got to know your stuff about film as well. And that means going right back to the beginning and understanding, the history of cinema in general. So the history of good journalist, history of cinema, history of the other arts. And then, this makes people laugh, you have to be a decent human being, because films are about people. And if you don't like people, you're never going to be a very good critic. So that may seem absurd, but you have to have some humanity. Some of the critics who know exactly who the butler was in a 1936 film are not like that. They just talk about film as film alone, and not about people, not about what the film's about. And I don't like that at all. So I'm not saying I have all these virtues, but you've got to have all of them to be a really good critic. Well, there's all the things that I've said, but it depends on the paper you're writing for. You can't write against the paper's policy completely. Even if you wanted to, it's very difficult to do that. And you probably don't want to if you're on The Guardian anyway. So there are actually two types of critics. They're the critics who say, I watch the thing that's up on the screen. I don't care how much it was made, for how much it was made. I don't care who the director is. I don't care anything. I want to see whether I like the film or whether the film's any good, full stop. And there's the other type, which I think I am, is worrying about, well, this film was hellishly difficult to make. It was made on a very small budget. The chap's, done really well considering, and taking all that into consideration. Or the opposite. This was a huge film, and it's awful, So, I mean, there are those two types of critics, but for newspapers, you have to understand that you're under an editor, and the editor will not let you say no to The Sound of Music as a single word review. And you have to sort of understand that you're working for a paper which has certain values, and let's hope you agree with those values.
You haven't really brought evaluation into the discussion yet. What I mean by evaluation is, and you've alluded to it, to saying whether a film is good or not. But I mean, I guess the ultimate reductive form of evaluation that's used conventionally in reviews today is something like the star rating, or thumbs up, thumbs down, or some kind of symbolic evaluative mechanism. And I wonder where you stand on those. I mean, for example, actually, may I ask, just as a point of information, would I be right in thinking that star ratings would have been introduced, in fact, as a phenomenon to reviews during your tenureship in the Guardian?
Yes, and with much objection from a lot of critics, including myself, because we know perfectly well that if you put 1 star, they read it because they want to see how awful it was. And if you put 5 stars, they read it because they want to see how good it is. But the general run of films, 2 stars and 3 stars, they're not very interested in. Or they just pass on. They don't read your copy, but they read the stars above it. And I'm afraid that's what's happened now, very much so. I mean, I do it myself. When I read Peter Bradshaw in The Guardian and I see the stars, it's only the stars that interest me. If it's 1 star, I read it to see if it's a funny review. Or if it's 5 stars, I read it to see what he thinks of the film, really, how good it is. But sometimes I just don't bother to read the rest. I just look at the stars. And I'm sure a lot of people do that.
Were they happier times for you as a writer before star ratings came in? When literally all there was for the reader to see was your copy and on the page.
Well, there were happier times, but then there were happier times when I started film criticism than there are now. If I went to Cannes and I saw a little African film and I liked it, I'd ring The Guardian up and say, I've just seen this excellent African film. And they'd say, oh, give us a review of it, and could you possibly review the director? Now, if you see a small African film at Cannes, unless it's a masterpiece, they say, okay, well, keep it short. So that's how it's changed. What they want is the star films at Cannes, the films which are probably the least interesting, but they've got a big star in them. I've never had a star rating altered ever. No, not on The Guardian, nor even on The Standard, oddly enough.
And when you started using them, did you find that it was quite natural to assign a rating to any one of your reviews, or would you torture yourself over?
No, I wouldn't really torture myself. I mean, it was pretty natural. I would torture myself between 4 and 5. I very rarely gave 5. Some critics give quite a lot of 5s, but I very rarely did, unless it was a semi-masterpiece. And you can't tell that until 2 years later anyway.
you've obviously been a critic for some decades now, and I wonder what changes film criticism has undergone in the time that you've been a journalist, and what sort of changes, and have they been for the better, for the worse, or just?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that because honestly, it's got much, much worse. Not necessarily on The Guardian, although the poor old Guardian critic has to do far more work than I ever had to, because he's got to do podcasts and video links and stuff for the net as well as his stuff. I mean, Peter Bradshaw comes out of the 8:30 screening at Cannes, which is the main screening of the day very often, and he has to write a piece for the net, first of all, then he has to rush in and do a podcast, and then he has to come back and do his proper review for the paper. And I should think by 1 o'clock he's completely exhausted. And every day he has to do that. And then there's other films to see. So it's a really tough job if you're lucky enough to be a film critic. Not many people now are film critics on the staff of newspapers. They're usually freelancers who are used. And if you're a freelance, there's no money in film criticism whatsoever. You couldn't make a living as a film critic.
On new media, and I guess I'm thinking of kind of blogs and podcasts and social media like Twitter and Facebook, and also aggregators like Rotten Tomatoes. Are they, broadly speaking, a boon or a bane to film criticism, or are they just indifferent?
Well, considering the fact that the film critics are much weaker now than they were, I mean, weaker in getting money, weaker in being on the staff, and weaker in the fact that arts don't sell as well as sport, for instance. And so a lot of papers relegate it much more than they used to. Considering that, I think the other media are very useful. I mean, a lot of rubbish is written on the net, obviously, and twittering and all that sort of thing. Sometimes it's awful, but at the same time, sometimes it's very good. And there are good people writing. In America, half the best critics have been sacked in the last 3 years, and they're now writing for the net. So if you want to know about an American film or a British film in America, you go to the net, you don't go to the newspapers.
The difficulty, of course, has been monetizing the net, working out how to convert all that easy access and easy coverage into something that actually pays the writer, which some publications and some sites have managed to do, but I think the majority don't.
Yes, it's almost impossible to make any money that way. The Critics' Circle in London have just brought out an edict that we should, all of us, refuse to write for nothing. And I said to them, well, I'd rather write for nothing than not write at all, and that's what a lot of freelancers feel, because at least it gives them an entree somewhere. But maybe it'll work, I don't know. Apparently 30 people have signed up that they will not write for anybody unless they get paid, even if it's a small amount. But I wonder whether it's going to work. It's a very bad situation for critics now. There are lots of capable critics who haven't got any work at all and have more or less given up. And it's a terrible thing. And there are newspaper critics who don't know what the hell they're talking about, because they're young people, very often, who have no real background in film, but just write a nice piece. That's what editors want now, a nice piece. You know, saying this is bloody awful, or this is a masterpiece, and chatting about the stars. And I mean, you know, when A Separation came out, the famous Iranian film, a major critic said to me, I didn't know they made films in Iran. So, I mean, dear, oh dear, I said, well, only the last 50 years. You know, they'd no idea, you see. And you can tell in the end that they've no idea when they suddenly come across a good film from China or wherever it is. They just don't know the background. And some of the reports on Bollywood films in this country saying how wonderful they are just ignorant crap, you know, because, you know, most of them are awful. but there are some good ones, and there were in the 30s and 40s wonderful Bollywood films amongst the chaff. But you've got to know. You really have to know something about the history of film. Not everything, you can't, nobody can. And I'm worried about the young people because where did they see these films? It's very difficult to educate yourself really without actually doing a course or something somewhere. Well, I would miss going to some of the festivals because I've got so many friends at the festivals and also a lot of foreign critics I know. And, you know, it's another world, and it's a better world, really, for watching movies than your average week in London.
Do you still go to screenings in London as well? Do you go to press?
Well, I keep on saying I'm going to, and then say, oh, fuck it, and I get the video.
Yeah, no, I understand, believe me.
But, you know, Nigel Andrews of the Financial Times, he said to me, when he goes to press shows nowadays, there's only 3 or 4 people there.
Okay. Yeah. Is that for the national press screenings? The ones
Yes.
that we can release screenings.
Yes.
Really?
Yes. Very few people there. They must be saying, well, there's 15 films. If you want a review, send me a DVD or Vimeo.
For the small ones, they almost always do have a DVD.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess since we're being pessimistic, do you think that print is in its death throes, or does print have a future?
I think print probably does have a future. I mean, it's got to be radically different. I don't know that we can sustain in England 9 different daily papers anymore. And there must be a way of getting some money from the web. I mean, The Guardian is losing a lot of money now as a print. But as on the web, it should be making an awful lot of money. If only it could decide how to do it. But it can't. So I have a feeling, though, that print will come back a little bit. Not as it was before, but people, you know, if the country's getting older, as it certainly is, people over 60 still want to read the bloody paper, not fart about on the computer they don't understand how to get, you know. And people are beginning to realize that, okay, you can look up the film criticism in The Guardian on the web, but you might miss a story which you really would like to read, but you haven't sort of found it on the web, or you don't know about it. So I have a feeling that the papers, instead of appealing eternally to younger people with large pieces about hairdressers and cookery and all the rest of it, and stars, if they actually appeal to the more mature audience, they do rather well. Because I think the more mature audience still likes to read a paper, as well as looking in their computers. And of course, a lot of people over 60 haven't a clue about computers anyway.
Does it matter to you personally whether your copy appears online or in print?
I'd rather it was in print because that's what I've been doing all my life. But yes, it does matter. However, I've been quite pleased if it's online.
What future do you see for film criticism, and more specifically for the professional film critic? And by professional, I mean paid, in effect.
Well, there are going to be fewer and fewer of us, and they're going to be younger and younger because they can pay them less. And it's true in newspapers that art don't sell papers. Sport sells papers, politics sometimes does, and news items do too. But the arts don't really sell papers. So I've noticed the Standard since I left has got less and less arts reviews. Still got some, but less and less. And I think that's true of a lot of papers, not The Guardian, but certainly a lot of other papers. So the future of film criticism, paid film criticism for newspapers, is pretty dim. But there'll always be exceptions. There'll always be people who transcend that. There might be a new Kenneth Tynan or something like that, whom they want to put in the paper because he's controversial or very good writer.
And do you think that there's any reason why the views of a professional or paid critic should be valued above those of an amateur critic?
Uh,
And if so, why?
no, I think there's some amateurs very good, and some professionals are terrible. So, well, as in America, I mean, a lot of the best critics are now amateur, virtually amateur critics. And it's true in England too. I mean, I can think of several people who don't write anymore, whom I would value much more strongly. But I think a good amateur is just as good as a good professional sometimes better, because he hasn't got the worry of what the editor's going to think, or what the arts editor's going to think, or how much he's got to write and when he's got to write it, you know.
Do you think there's any risk of film criticism in future becoming an activity for hobbyists?
I hope not. I hope it's not going to become an activity for hobbyists. But I think it's very likely that it will be for a lot of people. I think there's a lot of people who would like to be film critics, who can't muster the money to be a film critic. You've got to have a private income, I reckon, to be a film critic now, unless you're actually on a paper being paid. And there are fewer and fewer of those.
And what do you think, let's imagine this scenario in the future where everyone is a hobbyist, there are no paid critics, or very, very few. What's lost? What does film criticism lose in that scenario?
Well, I think what film criticism has lost, because of this state of affairs, is influence. And I don't actually think there's much influence from film critics, unless it is for small independent pictures and foreign movies. You know, there I think they still have some influence. Don't think they have much influence on a big Hollywood film, unless they all say it stinks, or they all say it's wonderful. I was amazed at the gentle reviews of the new Star Wars film, which is much better than many of the other ones in the past, which were awful. But everybody giving it 5 stars, and I thought, where are we, for God's sake? I would have given it 4, but not 5. So I think critics are bound now to pretend to be popular, pretend to like the stuff that the public likes, because they're very frightened that they'll otherwise be forced into a corner. That was always my problem on the Standard. That in fact, you know, I clearly had very little sympathy for the very films that the Standard's public, they thought, would like. And sometimes the films that the Standard's public would really be bored stiff by, I said were good. So I was always fighting against the editorial policy of the paper. On The Guardian, that was not true. Even so, if you notice the number of times that Peter Bradshaw leads with a Hollywood film, you'd be surprised, and doesn't lead with a really good foreign film. I mean, you give it a good review, but he won't lead with it. So I think the pressure is on there too. But certainly in most papers, if you don't lead with the big Hollywood film, they won't keep you there for very long.
You mentioned, in that answer, you mentioned sort of pressures from at an editorial level that can sometimes come down upon a critic. But now, especially with the growth of online journalism, one of the things you notice is a lot of pressure coming from the public. There's far more opportunity now for the public to respond to criticism and to have their say, often in a very strongly expressed manner. Do you see the kind of discursive aspect that's been opened up by online journalism as being actually good for criticism? I mean, is it good that criticism has become something like a public conversation?
Well, I don't think it's bad. I'm not sure it's frightfully good, but I don't think it's that destructive. It's not what I thought criticism was about when I started. But okay, you know, if it is, if people chip in. I never used to get many letters when I was writing for The Guardian. And one way or another, you know. When I left, I got some letters, but not while I was there.
Plus, any letters that you received were private letters, whereas now
Yes, now
the article,
now it's public.
Most of the responses are extremely public. Do you read responses to, say, reviews that you write for the Huffington Post?
Oh yes.
Do you respond, or do you stay, or do you think?
I don't. No, I leave it unless it's easy to respond, and you really want to respond because you think it's totally inaccurate and wrong. But no, otherwise you. My wife does. She's on Twitter all the time. She's an author, and she's left journalism, and she now writes books, and she gets lots and lots of stuff from people who've read her books. And
are you on Twitter?
Yes, I am.
And you're on Facebook as well.
Yeah, but I can't get. I've lost my password for Facebook, and I'm so fed up with them saying, "Would you like to do a new password?" And oh, fuck off! You decide not bother. And also, they then you get an email saying somebody's mentioned something you've done on Facebook, and it's nothing of the sort. It's some, it's some crap, about somebody else, and you might be mentioned very, very briefly, and it doesn't make any sense. So I don't worry. Do you do Facebook?
I do. I'm on both Facebook and Twitter. But I was curious whether you regard them as just a digression from your normal.
Yes, I do.
Or whether you actually incorporate them as a central tool for your journalism.
I don't. No, I can't say I do. But I do. I wrote a tweet about Anomalisa saying, never mind, go to see it for Christ's sake, something like that. Or you must see the such and such or you must see something at the National Film Theatre. So, but...
So you use it for advocacy?
I use it for advocacy, or sometimes saying, what on earth is critics doing giving so many 5 stars? And when it actually comes to a really 5-star film, where are they going to go? But I don't know that anybody pays any attention.
Star Wars was a funny one. I think it was a very... it's impossible to have an objective view on a film like that because everyone's coming at it with so much baggage. But I do think that the PRs in restricting press screenings to just one. There was one.
Oh yes.
One press screening, and they ensured that not everybody got tickets to it. It was a little exclusive. I think in doing that, maybe Star Wars is too special a case for me to make this generalisation, but I think it's something like Spectre, say, that creates its own buzz amongst the critics, and the critics who see the very first screening are always going to write positive reviews.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
And, I think the critical community in Britain completely embarrassed itself over Spectre. Personally, yes.
But then you have to play your luck if you happen to be on a paper and you get paid. It's very difficult to maintain total independence when you know that everybody's being sacked all around you and so-and-so's disappeared from view.
But do you think that in the current climate, it really is the case that you can be sacked or you can be looked upon disapprovingly by your publication simply for not liking a certain kind of film?
It does happen. It does happen that if you don't like a certain kind of film, which is very popular and they feel should be approved of, maybe the editor's seen it and thinks it's wonderful, then I think you're on a slightly sticky wicket. I don't think you'd be sacked outright, but I think when it came to the next series of redundancies, you might be among the names.
And you might be aware that that's possible.
Yes, you might be aware that that's possible.
The way we all behave.
Well, all I can say is that I think I've been incredibly lucky to be a film critic of The Guardian for so long and to meet Bunwell, Orson Welles, everybody, John Ford. I can tell you funny stories about a lot of them. Fellini, Tarkovsky, and of course my greatest pride is meeting Laurel and Hardy. That I think is better than any of them. However, and Charlie Chaplin, and all these people, how many film critics working now can do that? It's not because I was any good. It was because I was the Guardian, you see. I had lunch with Bunwell, who didn't speak a word of English, or hardly any.
Was there an interpreter?
I got, yes, there was. I was stuck in a lift with Orson Welles and a huge dog, his huge dog. And Orson Welles had had at least 2 bottles of brandy that day. And when it came to the 8th floor, none of us could get out. I got into a lift with Roger Moore once, whom I knew perfectly well, and said, "Hello, Roger," not a word. And when we got up to the 12th floor, he turned to me and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Derek, but I never speak to anyone in lifts."
I've heard that Roger Moore is one of the greatest gentlemen that there is in
Well,
the show
he
business.
was very nice about it. But it was just a
Never speaks
thing.
to anyone in
I
lifts?
don't speak to anyone in lifts, I'm sorry. I thought it was very funny. And then I had a wonderful interview with John Ford. Shall I tell you?
Please.
Well, John Ford hated film critics. He really didn't. He'd never give them interviews. But somehow or other, I managed to get an interview with him in Venice when he was an old man. And Peter Bogdanovich had just put on all the John Ford films at the Venice Festival. How I got the interview, I don't know, but I arrived at his door in his suite at the Excelsior, the most smart hotel on the Lido. Knocked on the door, and his wife came to the door and said, "Look, I'm terribly sorry, but I'm afraid John has eaten something last night, probably some fish or something, and I don't think he's going to be able to give an interview. I'm really sorry about that." And just at that moment, there was a bellow from somewhere near the bathroom. "Come on in, I can deal with 2 shits at once." That's a true story.
So you literally interviewed him while he was doing his
No.
business?
He came out and sat down. And I thought, well, look, he doesn't want any intellectual questions, that's for sure, because he hates critics. So I asked him, I said, I was a jockey once. He said, "Well, why did you become a film critic, for Christ's sake?" or something. And I said, "Well, I want to know where you get your horses from." And he was very interested in that. "Well," he said, "there's this ranch, you know." And then he told me that John Wayne was an awful horseman. Get him onto a horse was bad enough, to get him off was impossible. And it was quite a good interview in the end. But I've been very privileged, in interviewing. I spent a day with Howard Hawks once.
Howard Hawks?
Yeah.
Are they?
A whole
Well,
day.
like following him on a set or just...
No, I was just with him in San Sebastian, and we went to Pamplona for the bulls. He's such a bloody macho fool. Nearly got himself killed. But he was funny, he wouldn't answer any questions. I mean, those were the days of when the BFI was full of Marxist semiologists, and they would ask him tormenting questions. He'd say, "What the fuck?" He'd no idea. He'd no idea. But he did say to me things like, "You have to look after Cary Grant, because he wears women's underwear, You have to look after him." It's very funny. God, I didn't put that in the paper. But I mean, interviewing Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, all those people, and Laurel and Hardy. Oh my God!